In this, I'm going to discuss the idea of literary nonfiction, as well as a brief set of comments on Langston Hughes' Salvation. Literary nonfiction, very commonly known as creative nonfiction, is a literary form of prose that is about things that are true. Prose is simply writing that is patterned after the normal human speech, right? Fiction is prose, nonfiction is prose, your textbooks are prose, those sorts of things, right? Fiction is, of course, making up fictional worlds, is made up, right? That there is something untrue and completely imaginary about it. It may be based in the real world, it may be based on a real event, but there are things that the author just made up in their own, for their own purposes. They took some poetic license. Or it could be something completely fantastical, like any fantasy novel, right? Lord of the Rings is obviously fiction. Such things do not exist. Creative nonfiction, as I said, it's prose, but it's about things that are true. Your book gives you some definitions of them, of the different types of nonfiction you may encounter, including things like expository nonfiction or argumentative nonfiction, these things that we read that are essays, that are critical things that people are reading, writing to a purpose. But then there are a number of things that are thinking about life experiences, right? Telling a story out of one's own life, like Langston Hughes, the sort of narrative nonfiction. You will also encounter personal essays. And these are things that are about the author's reflections on a topic, on an idea. Nonfiction is an incredibly wide range of things, but what all of these different forms, whether it's something that is a memoir or a personal essay or something we call new journalism, right, or nature writing, what they all have in common is a specific attention to poetic language, right? That this isn't about the kind of writing we do for academic papers, right? That this is attending to language in a way that a writer of a story also attends to language, that a poet also attends to language. It's not just about being clear, it is also interested in saying things beautifully. I think that's sort of our essential starting point where we can begin on this genre. We can ask many of the same questions that we ask about short stories. In Salvation, for example, we clearly have rising action, a climax, and a denouement. But that's not always going to be the case. So we need to give it a bit more flexibility. We need to be willing to sort of follow along, because a lot of times people are drawing stories out of their own lives, seeing connections or reflecting on those things. And certainly Hughes here in this very brief piece reflects pretty profoundly on his own faith journey, his own experience in realizing what he thought he believed is not true. It is not the thing that he thought it would be. So like I said, we can ask many of the same questions, but your book also provides you some other things to think about. Sometimes you will have a thesis of sorts, but not always. Even that is not always going to be 100% true in creative nonfiction. But it is an important genre, and it is a very popular genre for writers at this point. There's a lot of really good stuff going on in that. Okay, so Salvation by Langston Hughes is from a larger work of his, but this is one small incident in his childhood. And so we can look at it and think about sort of what it is that he expects. And we could connect this back to A&P. We can connect it back to Araby. In particular, this idea of thinking one thing as a child, realizing it's not true, and what is the result. And for Hughes, as for the narrator, particularly of Araby, it's devastating. That there is this devastation, but it's interesting in Hughes that the devastation is one that only he sees and that the people around him do not understand. So his expectation as a child, right, is to go to this revival and to be able to see Jesus, right? That he expects that he is going to be saved. That's the goal of a revival. He writes on page 299, "My aunt told me that when you were saved, you saw a light and something happened to you inside, and Jesus came into your life, and God was with you from then on." Now, if we look at this and we look at the punctuation, we know there's excitement, right? That he is so adamant and excited, he's using exclamation points, which we rarely see, but that's so important here. She said you could see and hear and feel Jesus in your soul. And so we have a sense, right? She said you could see and hear and feel Jesus in your soul. So that repetition of and, which we normally wouldn't do in everyday speech, breaks those things down. It breaks those things apart. We have these fairly long sentences and then a very short sentence. I believed her. I had heard a great many old people say the same thing, and it seemed to me they ought to know. So I sat there calmly in the hot, crowded church waiting for Jesus to come to me. And so that's where we begin, right? The conflict really is for young Langston that he expects to see and hear and feel Jesus. He has been told you will see a light and Jesus will come into your life. This is what he expects. He's a child. Children are very literal. And that's fine, right? Children are literal people. He really can't recognize that metaphor. But it has a deeper significance for him than just that metaphor being a problem. He kept waiting, right? I kept waiting to see Jesus. Other people, right? Other people around him, all the other little girls run up, right? The preacher is preaching hellfire and damnation. Of course they're going to run up, right? They're children. And he and Wesley are the only two left. And Wesley is, there's something almost comic in Wesley's behavior, right? Or the way that Hughes describes Wesley. And finally Wesley said to me in a whisper, "God damn, I'm tired of sitting here. Let's get up and be saved." Right? So there's something comic in this moment. So Wesley, out of frustration and boredom, gets up and gets saved. But here he sits. He continues to sit, and there's so much pressure on him, this child, to be saved in this revival. But he wants to be honest, right? He does not see Jesus. He does not see the light. And that's where he becomes frustrated. He becomes disillusioned in this event. So what leads him to do it is the moment of realizing God had not struck Wesley dead for taking his name in vain or for lying in the temple. So I decided that maybe to save further trouble, I'd better lie too and say that Jesus had come and get up and be saved, right? Save further trouble. He's doing this so this can be over, right? Not because he believes anything. He's accepting, right? So I got up, and he goes, and everything is wonderful. And when we think about the final paragraph of this, we need to look carefully. We need to contrast what he knows he was thinking and what his aunt thinks he's thinking, right? That night, for the last time in my life but one, for I was a big boy, 12 years old, I cried. I cried in bed alone and couldn't stop. I buried my head under the quilts, but my aunt heard me. She woke up and told my uncle I was crying because the Holy Ghost had come into my life and because I had seen Jesus, right? So Auntie Reed assumes, right? She says to his uncle, it's because he saw Jesus, right? Because he's been saved. He is so overwhelmed with emotion. But Langston knows, right? But I was really crying because I couldn't bear to tell her that I had lied and that I had deceived everybody in church, that I hadn't seen Jesus, and that now I didn't believe there was a Jesus anymore since he didn't come to help me. So we have this sadness, this grief over a failure of faith, right? This recognition that perhaps the world was not what he thought it was, right? If the grown-ups told him this was the thing that happened, he doesn't experience it. What else are grown-ups wrong about? What else do grown-ups not tell him about? Is there something else? So we have this child, right, who's going through this period of growth, this move from childhood into adulthood, into understanding what the world is like. Again, we see this in many of these texts in this first section of the book, in the innocence to experience section. And what we want to think about is not only how they're different in terms of, well, of course they're different stories, but how do they treat that move from innocence to experience? It is different in each one, right? So that's what we want to pay attention to here. We want to think about these themes. We want to draw on specific pieces of text, right? We can't do it just very broadly. We need to look at the words on the page. And that's what Hughes is doing here. We can pay attention to that. We can pay attention to how he puts the words together, the diction and the syntax, as well as the topic that he is dealing with.